Hi, this is Jennifer Gunn. I am not seeing my own picture. I'm seeing Brianna Minning's name, but welcome to IAS Thursdays. I'm Jennifer Gunn and I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. And I want to get this event today started by reminding us that we are all residing on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The University of Minnesota is located on Dakota land, ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The IAS acknowledges this place has a complex and layered history. This land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and the community about the land and our relationships with it and with each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. So today is an unusual pleasure because occasionally the Institute for Advanced Study is able to invite a speaker who's been requested by one of our faculty fellows. And this fall, Greta Friedman Sanchez, who's a professor in the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and works on the issue of harmonizing security policies on intimate partner violence in post-conflict Columbia, asked that we invite Professor Valerie Hudson. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Valerie Hudson, who is the University Distinguished Professor and holds the George H.W. Bush Chair in the Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, where she also directs the program on women, peace, and security. Dr. Hudson is a co-founder and principal investigator of the Women's Stats Project. Check it out at womenstats.org online. And this project database includes the largest compilation of data on the status of women in the world today. Dr. Hudson is also co-author of a number of award-winning books, among them Bare Branches, Sex and World Peace, The Hillary Doctrine, and The First Political Order, How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide, from which she's drawing her talk today. Her research has been funded by the Minerva Initiative of the U.S. Department of Defense, the Compton Foundation, and the Andrew Carnegie Corporation. Professor Hudson was named to the list of Foreign Policy Magazine's top 100 global thinkers for 2009. And in 2015, she was recognized as Distinguished Scholar of Foreign Policy.
Hello, everyone. So sorry. It looks like Jennifer, our director, had a web issue. And so I unfortunately don't have the full introduction for Dr. Hudson in front of me. I'm Brianna Menning with the Institute for Advanced Study, and I will hand it off from here. Dr. Valerie Hudson, we are so happy to have you joining us for your presentation today. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Valerie Hudson for her presentation.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here. And I had a marvelous session with some of the professors earlier today. And so I'm very much looking forward to presenting my own research to you. And I know that we're going to have a wonderful conversation. So I'm going to utilize a PowerPoint. So let me just give me a moment to make that happen here. Okay, wonderful. Let's see here. So Brianna, I just want you to know that I cannot see the chat box or anything when it's in slideshow mode. So if for any reason you need to contact me, tell me to stop, whatever, you're going to have to actually unmute yourself and say, you know, you need to stop now. Does that
Got
make
it.
sense?
Yep, we can do that. We'll make it work. Thank
Wonderful. All right, I won't be able. I'm sort of blind once you're in slideshow mode. So, okay,
Yep.
thank you so
Sounds
much.
great.
All right, let's see if we can make this happen. Okay, so I'm here today to actually discuss our brand new book that just came out a few months ago, and it's called The First Political Order: How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. As you can imagine, given our time constraints, I'm only going to give you the Reader's Digest version. I'm going to hit the highlights, and then during the discussion section, I'm happy to go into anything in more detail. Okay. All right. So the premise of our book, which is a premise I think that feminism has asserted for decades, if not over a century, is that the very first political order in any society is the sexual political order established between men and women. And that the character of that first order is going to deeply mold the society, its governance, its behavior, many things about that society. Oftentimes I tell my students, I say, okay, let's pretend we're a video game design class and not a political science class. And the only parameters I've given you is I want you to make a game. And in this game, there's going to be, you know, generally speaking, two groups. And these two groups have to cooperate or there's no second round. All right, these two roughly equal sized groups must cooperate or there's no second round. And at that point, they usually come back and they say, well, Professor Hudson, we need to know a little bit more. Tell us about these two groups. Do they stand before each other as equals, or is one group sort of considered superior and the other group inferior? Will decisions for the group be made by one of these groups, or must both groups agree? If the two groups disagree, will conflicts be resolved peacefully or by force and domination? And lastly, with regard to valuable resources, will those be distributed equally between members of the two groups, or can one group extort resources from the other? And I say, you know what? Those are all excellent questions. And at the heart, each of those questions is deeply political. These are questions about power. And how power is going to influence important matters like decision making and conflict resolution and resource allocation. And so when I speak about a first political order established between men and women within a society, I'm speaking very literally. This is a political order. Now, when I first began to research women and national security many years ago, I first started to look at indicators of what I felt were measuring women's empowerment. So I would look at variables such as female literacy, female labor force participation, female parliamentary representation, only to discover that we have countries in our world where female literacy is high and the subordination of women is high, where female labor force participation is high and subordination is high, where female parliamentary representation is high, such as we see in Rwanda, and the situation of women is still very subordinated. In fact, about 15 years ago now, My university at the time was hosting a group of female members of the newly elected Loya Jirga in Afghanistan, the first elections after the invasion of Afghanistan. And I was supposed to host one particular member of this group. And over lunch, I was trying to discuss, to talk about how wonderful it was. So here she was university educated, she was a doctor, she'd been a practicing pediatrician, and now she was a member of parliament. And I was talking about how wonderful it was and how empowered women in Afghanistan were becoming. And she stopped me cold and she said, "Valerie, you don't understand. I could go home today and my husband could divorce me simply by saying, 'I divorce you' 3 times." And she said, if he did divorce me, I would not have custody of my children because in Afghanistan, custody of the children goes with the father. And she said, if he divorced me, I would have nowhere to live because my father's family would not take me back. And she said, even if my husband doesn't divorce me, I may have very little say in who my children marry or when they married. And she says, so how empowered am I really, Valerie? And I realized then that I'd been kind of looking in the wrong place, and that what I really did need to look at was the political order established at the household level. And most of the time, this order is established through law and custom concerning marriage and inheritance. So the kinds of things I realize I need to look at in order to see, in order to uncover, if you will, the first political order in any society are the answers to questions such as, how much say does a woman have about getting married? How old is she when she's married? How much say does a married woman have within that marriage? What types of property and inheritance rights do women have as wives and as daughters? Are there inequities in family law, such as in matters of divorce and child custody, that this woman was speaking to me about? Is marriage patrilocal, where brides leave their family and go to live with the groom and his family? Are bride price or dowry paid? Is polygyny or cousin marriage prevalent? Does the society view domestic violence and femicide as normal, even expected, at times even obligatory for cases of honor? And lastly, another really great marker is whether rape is treated as a property crime against a man. That is, that it's not the woman who's raped, but it's the woman's husband or the woman's father who has been wronged. So after realizing that that's where I needed to look, my co-authors and I began to realize that in many, many societies, in fact, all traditional societies, we're looking at an interlocking web of mechanisms that allow for the subordination of female interests to those of male interests within the society. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see in the upper left, right, a willingness by males to violently coerce females, right, is kind of the engine of all of this. But it begins to lead to things like males controlling access to valuable resources and women lacking the ability to control resources such as land or other important property. And patrilineality and patrilocal marriage begin to develop, where the true family is the male line, and women are marrying out from that male line and are, in a sense, neither members of their birth family nor members of the family into which they marry. And this, of course, leads to son preference. Sons are the real family and daughters are not the real family. And a general devaluation of the lives of daughters and wives follows from this, which also leads to a low age of marriage for girls, because girls may be a burden that the birth family is unwilling to continue to support. Leading to a generalized deep inequity in family and personal status law and customs, such as concerning divorce and child custody and other matters like that. Coming up the left side, then, we often see sort of two manifestations of this kind of generalized subordination of women. In societies where women's labor is valuable, such as in much of sub-Saharan Africa, we often see the development of the customs of bride price and polygyny. Bride price, where a groom's family must pay the bride's family to contract the marriage, and polygyny, where rich men can buy many wives through paying bride price. Where women's labor is not considered valuable, we often see dowry accompanied by sex ratio alteration taking place, where the bride's family must pay the groom's family to take the burdensome bride off their hands, and where many families, as a result, choose not to have daughters. And this may be exacted through sex-selective abortion or in times past in outright female infanticide. So I want you to imagine then that this is kind of like a straitjacket, if you will, right? That these are interlocking subordinative mechanisms that make absolutely sure that male interests will dominate within a society. And as I mentioned before, these are fairly universal. You can find traces of these practices in virtually every society, historically speaking. But I'm here to tell you that this interlocking mechanism is a real monster, if you will. It is a monster that not only hurts women, but it hurts men, it hurts children, and it hurts societies. And why would that be? Well, because this syndrome, right, if we consider that loop diagram kind of an interlocking syndrome of subordination for women, this syndrome is really a trap. All right, so governance by extended male kin networks that arises from this syndrome leads to unfortunate outcomes for the entire group, including the men of the group. Instability, violence, terror, corruption, and autocracy. And it cannot help but do so because it is based on a first political order at the household level that is its parallel, right? Domestic instability, domestic violence, domestic terror, domestic corruption, domestic autocracy. All right, what you plant at the household level is going to take root within the entire society. Furthermore, the society will also experience other ramifications at the nation state level. Poor health, food insecurity, low economic performance, rentierism, demographic woes, and lack of attention to environmental security. In other words, if you're still listening, remember the one takeaway I want you to get from this presentation is what you do to your women, you do to your nation state. And if you curse your women, you have cursed your nation state as well. Now, Professor Dunn was mentioning that the Minerva initiative of the US Department of Defense funded the research that I'm talking about here today. In 2014, they gave us $1.3 million to see if there was any empirical evidence of what I've just been discussing. So we went out and for 4 years, we operationalized all those indicators in that syndrome diagram. And that took, let me tell you, a lot of effort and a lot of time because many of those variables have no data. No one's ever collected data on things such as prevalence of patrilocal marriage and so forth. So once we had done that, we were able to map it. And so this patrilineal fraternal syndrome is displayed before you. And you can see that many countries still have a significant legacy of this interlocking straitjacket for women. All right, so how is the subordination of women linked to macro security outcomes for the state? Well, let me give you a couple of examples so that you can see what I'm talking about. And there are many other examples that we could give, but these are two good ones. Sometimes the links are immediate and proximate. An example of this is actually bride price. We talked about bride price being the money and goods that a groom and his family must pay to the bride's family in order to contract the marriage. Well, bride prices act as a regressive universal flat tax on the subpopulation of young men. There tends to be a going rate for a bride. At very elite levels, the price may increase, but generally speaking, there's kind of a going price. So whether you're middle class or whether you're destitute, you'd have to come up with at least the average bride price in order to be to enter into the marriage market here. Now, though sometimes forced by governments into remaining static, sometimes governments try to cap bride prices. Bride price does tend to inexorably rise over time, and the rise can be dramatic and swift. And what we find is that surging bride prices are also linked to an increase in polygyny. That is, as rising bride prices price out very poor young men, rich young men take advantage of that and are able to increase the number of wives that they have. And this, of course, further obstructs marriage markets for disadvantaged young men. And what we find is a deep sense of grievance among young men is the result. In many of these societies, that may significantly delay or even preclude marriage for young men. And what we have found is that rebel and terrorist and insurgent groups identify that these young men are in fact aggrieved, and they offer to solve the problem for these young men, that if these young men are willing to be recruited into the groups, they will have a better than average chance of accumulating the type of bride price they would need to marry, or alternatively, the group will actually kidnap brides and provide brides directly. A great example of this took place in northern Nigeria with Boko Haram. In the early 2000s, there was a huge jump in bride price in northern Nigeria that took place over a fairly short period of time. So over the period of about 5 years, bride price had risen 100-fold. And Boko Haram openly used that as a recruiting strategy. I think the Western media certainly picked up that girls were being abducted to become brides or sold on the marriage chattel market. But what the Western media did not pick up is that Boko Haram would always leave a token bride price on the ground as the group left in order that those marriages be seen as legitimate within the society. One young lady who had been subjected to this kind of cruel treatment said, in this crisis, these men can take a wife at no extra charge. Usually it is very expensive to take a wife, very hard to get married, but not now. And scholars have done research to show that this very same linkage between surging bride prices and recruitment into rebel and terrorist groups have taken place in South Sudan, in Pakistan, in Timor-Leste, and in other places. Now, sometimes the linkage between the subordination of women and macro national level outcomes for security are longer term and structural. And here I would give you the example of the increasing masculinization of the world's population. In an unmanipulated population, the overall sex ratio should be approximately 98 men per 100 women, because women tend to live longer than men. But the male-female global ratio now, according to the United Nations, is over 101.8 men per 100 women. This is a huge alteration in the world's sex ratios, and it was not caused by any natural disaster or plague. This is an entirely man-made phenomenon. When I first started studying sex ratio alterations back in the early 90s, so in 1990, there were 5 nations that had abnormal birth sex ratios, and one of them was Hong Kong and one of them was Macau, which were, of course, part of China. But now, figures from 2015 show us that there are at least 18 countries with abnormal birth-sex ratios, and they're not all in Asia. So for example, we have Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, China and Hong Kong, Georgia, India, Kosovo, Latvia, Lebanon, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, Serbia, Taiwan, Vanuatu, and Vietnam. Furthermore, there are also localized sex ratio alterations, some of them dramatic, based upon large population movements, such as we see with recent migrant flows. The first wave of emigration tends to be primarily young adult men for very good reasons. And so in 2015, when a huge wave of migrants came into Europe, most of them, 85% or more of them, were young adult men. Many nations had particular strictures on how many and what type of immigrants, but Sweden, bless them, opened their doors completely. And they also stated that they would never deport anyone who had come to the country younger than age 18. So as you can imagine, lots of young men headed for Sweden, claiming to be 16 and 17. And some of them clearly were not 16 and 17, but the more important thing is what then happened to the sex ratio. So that in the next year when Sweden counted heads, it found that among its 16 to 17-year-old population, they now had 123 young men for every 100 young women in Sweden. And this actually far outstripped China, which nation has been associated with sex ratio alteration for a long time, not just the past century, but also dating back millennia. China only had a sex ratio of 117 young men of 16 and 17 per 100 young women. So Sweden quickly understood that it was actually drastically altering its national sex ratio, and it quickly reversed course on its immigration policies. Now, the research literature shows that sex ratio alterations in favor of males have significant implications for crime rates and political protest rates, which rates rise in lockstep with the degree of masculinization of the sex ratio. Marriage market obstruction obviously takes place because there are too few potential brides for the potential group. And so in bride price societies, of course, this means that bride prices are going to just take off like a shot. And for China is an excellent example of that, where now the average bride price is 200,000 to 250,000 renminbi, whereas at the turn of the century, it was only approximately 20,000 renminbi. Crimes against women, including trafficking and forced prostitution, increased significantly. And as a result, there's increasing mobility restriction for women, where women feel that they cannot go out at night, or they cannot go out alone, or they cannot go to certain parts of the city in which they live. HIV and other STD spread increases significantly. And there may even be an altered calculus of deterrence. That is to say, most nations are very leery of attrition warfare, but in societies with highly masculinized sex ratios, attrition warfare may not be looked at with the same anxiety at all. So is there any statistical evidence to suggest that the subordination of women does in fact or is associated with worse outcomes for nation states? And that's really what DoD wanted us to look at. So we did. We operationalized that syndrome indicator, as I mentioned before. and using multivariate regression with 7 control variables to control for things such as ethnic fractionalization, colonial history, urbanization, and others, we looked at 9 broad dimensions of nation-state outcomes, such as stability and governance, security and conflict, economic performance, and so forth and so on. We were also desirous to make sure that we couldn't be accused of lacking rigor in our analysis. So we used a stringent cutoff for statistical significance of a p less than or equal to 0.001. And for those of you who've taken statistic classes, you know that this is virtually never used as a cutoff for social science research. Okay, so you don't have to read the slide, but what we wanted to show you is that we went broad. That is, we looked at 122 different outcome indicators. And again, this was an effort to preempt any accusation that we could have cherry-picked our results by picking particular operationalizations that might accord with our hypothesis. So we looked at a variety of different indicators, not just across the dimensions, but also different operationalizations of the same phenomenon. So we have, for example, several different approaches to measuring the degree of terrorism within a society, conflict, economic performance, and so forth. So what were our findings? Well, I'm pretty sure that you are anticipating that we found some positive findings, and indeed we did. So for our 22 measures of political instability and freedom versus autocracy as form of government, we found that 93% of the model runs, that syndrome that we've been talking about was both significant and either had the largest or second largest effect size in the regression model. Conflict and insecurity, 75% of the model runs. 10 measures of terror, 80% of the model runs. 22 measures of economic performance, 62%. 31 measures of public health, 70.8%. 11 measures of environmental preservation, 85.7%. And I was really kind of blown away by that, because my co-authors had to convince me to include the environmental preservation variables. And they said, look, Valerie, the way you treat women is going to be the way that you treat Mother Earth. And I thought, that's a very interesting proposition. I wonder if there's anything to it. And apparently there is. Demographic security, over 70%. Educational attainment, 60%. Social progress, 75%. Across all the model runs, with all those 122 different outcome measures, we found that the syndrome was significantly related at the 0.001 level and had the largest or second largest in 71.3% of all of those nation state outcomes. In other words, this is a really important variable, the subordination of women. For those of you like odds rather than regression results, we did also do some logistic regressions and discovered that for every step worse a society takes in subordinating women, the odds of having a worse outcome on these 122 outcome variables is also significantly. So for example, for every step worse, there's twice the chance that your nation state will be a fragile state. 3.5 times the chance of having a government that's more autocratic, less effective, and more corrupt. 1.5 times the chance of being unstable and violent, and so forth and so on. 1.5 times the chance of having a low GDP per capita. 1.8 times the chance of scoring worse on the global hunger index. There's some significant associations here. Rose McDermott of Brown University had this to say about looking at women's subordination as a predictor of worse outcomes for nation states. And she said, the findings are clear, consistent, and statistically robust across the board. In fact, the results are the kind of thing most social scientists strive for, but almost never find in the course of their careers. If these findings were about something not related to women, chances are they would be treated as revolutionary in international relations theory. Indeed, the effects are much stronger than those supporting the notion of the democratic peace that has spawned an entire cottage industry of inquiry. I leave it to the reader to ponder why powerful effects regarding the treatment of women on the health and security of states do not receive such extensive attention. And I think that is an excellent question to be asking ourselves. So why do we get these results? I gave you a couple of examples, but here I'd like to speak a little more theoretically and suggest to you that we see at least 3 causal pathways at work. Number 1, boot camp. That is, there is no better training camp for political violence and instability than lived domestic terror perpetration at the household level, lived domestic corruption and exploitation, lived domestic autocracy. You have trained your entire society in the usefulness of political violence. And indeed, colleagues of mine in the women, peace, and security field have found through looking at survey and attitudinal data that holding highly unequal gender beliefs, that is the notion that women are inferior to men, is strongly associated with hostility towards minority groups within your own society, as well as hostility towards foreigners, as well as willingness to participate in political violence. And we think that our theory helps to explain why those associations would hold. Second, this syndrome that we've been examining in this research also creates chronic structural goads to instability. So inflationary bride price, which we've already talked about, prevalent polygyny, sex ratio alteration. These are ways in which you have hard-baked instability into your society. It's almost like you're removing one leg of a chair and expecting your society to balance after doing so. So kind of a structural cause of instability is at work here as well in our findings. And then lastly, of course, the subordination of women specifically disempowers women. That is the very individuals whose influence might otherwise profoundly challenge the calculus of political violence. So that's where we see the causality coming in here. So when I give this talk to security audiences in the DC area, I like to end my presentation by asking them if they consider themselves realists, national security realists. And those of you who are in the field know that, of course, right, if you're doing national security, you're going to insist that you're a realist, that you see things clear-sightedly and realistically. Well, in light of all the empirical findings that we've just been talking about, are you a realist if you believe that the treatment of women does affect national security? Are you a realist if you believe that the women, peace, and security agenda to bring in the perspectives and concerns of women is absolutely in the national interest? But more importantly, can you really call yourself a realist if you don't believe these things? And so at this point, usually my security studies audiences will say, okay, all right, we get it. We see that there's a linkage here. But what would you have us do? What would we be doing different if we adopted these gendered lenses? So at that point, I usually begin talking to them about how we might do some things differently. For example, if the US is not tracking the situation of women, especially at the household level, how can it affect to have an effective foreign policy? For example, how will it accurately anticipate instability in other countries if it's unaware of linkages between security and gender-related variables such as bride price trajectory and prevalence of polygyny and so forth? So this is the argument here from situational awareness, which is you'll have poor situational awareness if you're not tracking these gender-related variables. Interestingly, just last week, I heard from an old friend of mine who does instability and conflict forecasting for DoD and the intelligence community. And he said, Valerie, your name was dropped at a conference I just went to. And I was like, oh, what's this conference? And he said, it was a conference of risk analysts, those who model risk and forecast conflict. And he said that one presenter had suggested that we were overlooking variables related to women, and that we really all should be reading your book, The First Political Order, to see how important it would be to include these variables. And I had to laugh because it's the year 2020, and our cutting edge models to forecast conflict do not include any gender variables at all. That's stunning. But I'm hopeful that maybe what I heard last week is the start of something different. We'll have to see. When approaching a situation where there are various subnational actors vying for leadership or rulership within the society, how can the US decide which subnational actors are most likely to bring stability in the long term if it doesn't first examine how each group treats women or intends to treat women before making a commitment? Obviously, the ultimate example of this is the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, where looking over that terrain of possible subnational actors to support, the United States chose to support the group that promised to treat women the worst. And voila, it certainly did not lead to a stable society in Afghanistan and pulled us in once more after 9/11. But there was no one at the table to say, hey guys, can we also look at how these various groups are intending to treat women? Nobody said that. Nobody asked that. How will the US avoid the trap of peace negotiations where the rights of women are bargained away to make peace between warlords if it doesn't understand the linkage between sustainable peace and the empowerment of women? And of course, we're seeing this play out right now in Afghanistan. How will the US track which of its own citizens are the greatest internal threat if domestic violence, or what we would like to call domestic terror, is not taken seriously? And I think you're probably aware of research that's beginning to show that virtually all of our mass shooters and domestic terrorists have been either accused of or arrested for domestic violence against women, either their mother or their sister or their girlfriend or their wife. So I think this boot camp causal pathway, where men are trained in the functionality of violence, is certainly something that one needs to keep track of in terms of domestic violence. How will the US rationally approach immigration policy if it doesn't understand that the true clash of civilizations is not about what religion you belong to or what ethnicity you have, but about the subordination of women, whether your attitudes support the subordination of women? Australia has actually taken this to heart. It revised its citizenship test about 3 years ago and now actually includes questions about the treatment of women, such as, is female genital cutting legal in Australia? Is it legal in Australia to beat your wife, and so forth, which I think is really a good move forward. Good on Australia. How will the US know that ending child marriage worldwide would do more for world peace than almost any other investment? And here again, I see the importance of a gender lens. If you have a gender lens, then you can see that societies with prevalent child marriage are going to be mired in poverty and in violence for generations, and that changing the norms and the behavior concerning child marriage would do far more to alleviate instability in the world than almost any other possible programming. How will the US know when exporting democracy makes sense and when it doesn't? Clearly, if the households within a society are all practicing autocracy, it's going to be almost senseless to try to introduce democracy at the state level and have it mean anything real or significant. Certainly tracking whether a nation is improving concerning its treatment of women would be a marker that a country is moving in the direction of being primed for democratization. I believe that one day, and I think that one day will occur, you know, probably 20, 30 years out, but I think it's going to come. I think one day the idea that foreign or national security policy could ignore the situation of women will be seen as laughably naive. They will look back at our lectures and our syllabi and our textbooks, and the students of the future will say, where are the women? Why aren't we looking at what's going on with the women? Why aren't we looking at the first political order to understand the trajectory of these societies? I think they will be flabbergasted that there was a time when that was seen as kind of odd. So to conclude then, given the many outcome dimensions examined, I think it's fair to say that women's insecurity profoundly and significantly undermines state security. I think Hillary Clinton said it best when she was Secretary of State, speaking in International Women's Day in 2012, when she said, "The subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and to the national security of our country." Further, I think that disrupting the weak points of this syndrome may be foundational to undercutting the roots of instability, conflict, and ineffective governance. And I think only by adopting gender lenses within the broader security study field can we begin to see and act upon these linkages. So thank you so very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we can turn to a discussion.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I failed to give the Zoom instructions at the beginning, which is that this is a Zoom webinar. So we'd really appreciate it if you'd enter your questions in the little Q&A double balloons at the bottom of your screen. And then I'll read the questions to Valerie, and she can answer them. And while you all are typing away, I'll take the chair's prerogative, so to speak, and just say, so when you talk to the security people in DC, how do you see the process of persuasion and reshifting their thinking, in this direction?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. And I think it's still an uphill slog. I mean, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, it was less of an uphill slog, but there were still some major roadblocks there. One of the big roadblocks we identified even back when she was Secretary of State is how we actually do programming. So programming, say from the State Department or USAID, is farmed out through requests for proposals to big contractors, sometimes called Beltway bandits. But then it's not the big contractors that actually do the programming. They then farm it out to subcontractors, and the subcontractors farm it out to subcontractors. And so while the Beltway bandits may have a gender lens, in fact, they have to have a gender lens, USAID, for example, will actually not accept a proposal unless it has a gender component. By the time you get to the subcontractor level, it's gone. It's totally gone. And so the idea that we should be doing something for women because it's going to help national security is seen as just laughable at the subcontractor level, because many of those subcontractors are actually based in countries that highly subordinate women. So we even found cases where subcontractors were working for the US government and implementing gender programming during the day and running brothels and trafficking women at night. You know, it was just that bad. So I think there's that. And then I think with the shift from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, the idea that women are important for national security has become a kind of sidelined. As one person put it, it's become kind of a pet rock, which is in good times or in times of plenty, yeah, we'll take care of the pet rock. But, you know, when we have more important things to do, we're just gonna, you know, chuck the pet rock and leave it by the side of the road. And certainly I think that that's what's happening now with the wind down to what's going on in Afghanistan with the US presence, is that, you know, the American delegation is like, yeah, we care about women, but we're basically out of here. So you guys are just going to have to, you know, handle it all by yourself. And unfortunately, I think that that means that after we do finally leave, that many of the women who actually participated in a lot of this gender programming are going to have a big red target painted on them. And I expect that those are precisely the first people who will be disappeared under a new shared governance structure. So yeah, how to fight the good fight? I think you just have to keep chipping away, you know, at the empirical evidence. I think you need more women in positions, more women at the table who might be willing to take this more seriously. Not to say that there aren't men who take it seriously, there are. But it tends to be that a greater percentage of women take it seriously than currently the percentage of men who take it seriously. And you have to be savvy about the kind of allies that you have. You have to take advantage of the you know, legislation such as the WPS Act of 2017 that has reporting obligations and other types of mandates that the executive branch has to be responsive to. So there's a way to do it, but I don't think we're in for any sudden and overwhelming victories.
Well, that it might lead into the question we have from George Swan, who says, in case you want to comment, this news note from the Guardian News article today. The US has today signed an anti-abortion declaration with a group of about 30 largely illiberal or authoritarian governments after the failure of an effort to expand the conservative coalition. The quote, Geneva Consensus Declaration calls on states to promote women's rights and health, but without access to abortion, and is part of a campaign by the Trump administration, led by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, to reorient US foreign policy in a more socially conservative direction, even at the expense of alienating traditional Western allies.
Wow. Well, I got to tell you, I was not aware of that. So it's going to take me a little bit of time to process that and look for this Geneva Consensus Declaration. But wow, that's certainly revealing, isn't it? That's
Yes.
incredibly revealing. And I think what's fascinating is that I don't know how to put it nicely, but authoritarianism and the subordination of women always goes hand in hand. It really does. And so, you know, when you see Duterte in the Philippines and Putin in Russia and maybe Trump in the United States, I don't want to insult anybody, you know, who may be a Trump supporter for other reasons, you know, that it's not some sort of weird coincidence that authoritarians tend to be very dismissive of the need for women's empowerment. No, it's all of a piece. It's stemming from this first political order and how these leaders view the ideal first political order. Because an autocracy at the household level legitimizes an autocracy at the state level. And so these autocrats have a vested interest in, sort of shoring up household autocracy in order to maintain their state level autocracy.
Thank you. So Susanna Smith writes, this is incredibly interesting work. Thank you. Is anyone doing work to see the mirror of this syndrome? That is, to see whether the situation of women is deteriorating in nations that are currently on a downward slide into totalitarianism.
Oh, I guess we were just talking about.
I guess you just answered that.
Yes. I will never forget when under Putin, the domestic violence law in Russia was rewritten so that basically the first time you beat your wife, it's okay. And unless she has to go to the hospital, subsequent times, you're probably going to get away with it too. And I thought, how brazen to codify that into law. This really is kind of revealing, I think, of the autocratic mindset and its roots in that first political order that subordinates women.
Well, that's on that cheery note, here's another question. International development has focused on the subordination of women for decades, Sin, Kabir, etc., since the 1980s till today. The language used is not security, but capabilities approach and women's empowerment. Sin studies missing women in the 1980s. So one, what has development contributed to international relations in this area you are studying? And two, what language can we use that is common?
Oh, that's a marvelous question. And I'll just say to you that while one might think that international development is natively part of the field of international relations, it sometimes is not treated as such. And I think that's why you're asking this question. So for example, in the Bush School of Government and Public Service, which I don't think is terribly different from other international relations programs, there are interesting academic splits. Obviously, one is who does qualitative work, who does quantitative work. But the other interesting split is who does security studies and who does development studies. And they have separate meetings for their faculty. There are very few faculty that are considered to be in both fields. I'm kind of one of them, believe it or not, but there's hardly any of us who are considered as straddling both fields. There's a very, very different culture. So for example, on the security side, there's almost no women. On the development side, it's almost all women. So it's almost as if the field of development has, since the work of Esther Bosserup and others in the 70s and 80s, has almost been gender mainstreamed, while I think security studies is still very much in the masculinist mode. And so I think that's really only going to change as we begin to train graduate students to have a foot in both worlds. And I think also as we get more women who are becoming higher in academic rank on the security studies side. So I think you've actually put your finger on something that I've lamented for a long time. It's almost like that split. I think that the Department of Defense is viewed as masculine, but the State Department is viewed as feminine. And it's, once again, you're thinking, why are we even doing this? Why are we even assigning these kinds of gender attributions to things that are not going to be as effective if we do that to them, right? How does this make security studies, better at what it does to be very masculinist in its approach, in its membership, and so forth. I don't think it is any sort of advantage. I think it's a disadvantage. I think it's a disadvantage to think of state and DOD in those ways, right? So all of a sudden diplomacy is somehow wimpy, feminine, girly. I mean, you know, I think we lost something, right? When we start doing that kind of silly mischief.
Well, I think the same questioner sort of rephrased it in a shorthand sense, which you've partly addressed, and I'll just tack on. One, they say, so we should have a cabinet of development. And they're really asking, how can international relations and development collaborate and come together? And so your answer was, you know, get more senior people, get people with feet in both camps. Is there a more activist strategy to sort of jumpstart that?
Well, you must be thinking of one, Jennifer. So if you are, you know,
no, I'm not, because I mean, I am interested in how, you know, the changing challenges that the Academy is going to be facing in recent years may either encourage further siloing or greater sort of collaboration. But I really, I don't know. I mean, and I do think it's that question of the cabinet of development and where people go for careers as well.
Yeah, well said.
But okay, well, do we have any other questions? Oh, wait, let's see, I may have failed to do this. Okay, hang on here. Okay. I read too slowly, obviously, for Zoom. Well, I think that we have actually just had a really great day. The IAS fellows had the privilege of meeting with Valerie and hearing Greta Friedman-Sanchez talk about her work at lunchtime today. So I just want to say thank you for a refreshing if frightening perspective on the world, and for your generosity with your time and your insights. So thank you so much, and we will all give you a virtual Zoom clap, and hope that you will come back again. And other people are responding in the Q&A and saying thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate having the opportunity to address all of you.
Well, thank you for being here virtually, and you're probably not regretting that you were not here in the snow.
All righty, so long. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Valerie.